Looking for a Christmas gift for the political tragic in your life? What's the Big Idea is the first book from Australia Institute Press. It offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Sally McManus, Jennifer Robinson, Bob Brown, and Auntie Pat Anderson. The essays are a reminder that Australia matters and that the big challenges we face can be solved. Australia just needs the courage to face them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to get your copy in time for Christmas.
I do think the policies that the ALP took to the 2016 and 2019 elections, which is to focus negative gearing on new housing only and to reduce the capital gains tax discount from 50 to 25%, those are good policies and they should happen. And part of the reason they should happen, if not the main one, is because it would help change people's thinking about housing as an investment.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director of the Australia Institute, and the evidence of Australia's housing crisis is all around us. Families are under mortgage stress, renters are forced to choose between 3 meals a day and paying the bills, and young people have little hope of ever owning a home without access to the bank of mum and dad at the very least. Housing supply hasn't really kept up with demand, and tax breaks encourage people to treat housing like an investment instead of a human right. But for a lot of homeowners, rapidly increasing house prices is not the sign of a crisis. It's a wealth generator. And that's what makes this problem so politically challenging to deal with. Here to explain Australia's housing mess and what can be done about it is esteemed journalist and author Alan Kohler. Alan is the founder of the Eureka Report. He's the finance presenter on ABC News and a columnist for the New Daily. And he recently published a book called The Great Divide, Australia's Housing Mess and How to Fix It, building on his quarterly essay of the same name. In it, he writes that the fact that one of the 3 least populated countries on earth contains the world's second most expensive housing is a national calamity and a stunning failure of public policy. G'day, Alan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
G'day, Ebony.
So you open the book by describing how your parents, when they bought their first house, paid about 3.5 times their annual income, and it was roughly the same for you and your wife. What does that picture look like for your children?
It's now 9 times on average, and that's kind of roughly what my kids have had to do. The reason I use my parents and myself as the example is that in each case, in 1951, for my parents in 1980, for me, that 3.5 or 3 to 4 times income was the average house price to median income ratio, median house price to average income ratio. So my family's experience was pretty typical.
Yeah, and that picture has changed a lot. That's a huge increase, obviously.
We want to create a level playing field for people who are buying their first home with investors who are subsidised by taxpayer-funded subsidies. Labor's not going to continue putting $10 billion plus of taxpayer money into negative gearing. Why should a first homeowner have to compete on an unlevel playing field with someone who's buying their 5th or 10th property being subsidised by you?
Now, the way to tackle the housing crisis is scrap negative gearing and capital gains so a first home buyer gets a chance, and start to invest in public housing the way this country used to in the 20th century.
And you talk about in the book that things really started to go downhill for housing affordability after about the year 2000, and that a lot of that has to do with negative gearing and its interaction with the capital gains tax discount. So can you just explain briefly how those 2 policies have had such an impact on the housing market?
When I sort of started researching this book, or the quarterly essay, I thought the best way to deal with it would be to find out what has happened to house prices and when it happened, because I thought that might help inform why it happened, if I could see when it happened. And looking at the charts, it was clear that house prices started to increase rapidly and more rapidly than incomes from the year 2000. So the question is, what happened then? And the answer is that in 1999, December 1999, the Howard government reduced the capital gains tax by half, or they made it so that you only had to pay capital gains tax on half of any capital gain. Capital gains tax had been in place since 1985, and the deal up to 1999 was that you paid a capital gain, you added capital gains to your income minus the impact of inflation. So you got to deduct the CPI for each year that you'd held the asset. You got to deduct that CPI from the capital gain, and then you added the result to your income and paid tax on that. And that was changed in 1999 to be only adding half of a capital gain to your income. And that resulted from a business tax review that was commissioned by Peter Costello earlier that year with the intention of reducing the company tax rate from 36 to 30%. Costello and Howard wanted to do that, and they commissioned a review by 3 businessmen to basically tell them that that was a good idea, which they duly did, of course, because they were business people and they paid company tax and they wanted to pay less.
Makes sense.
They recommended the company tax rate be cut from 36 to 30%, and then kind of gratuitously, they added a recommendation in their report that the capital gains tax adjustment for inflation be replaced by a 50% discount, because they thought that that would result in people investing more in shares. They wanted to, they thought it'd be a good idea for Australia's productivity. It would be that if Australians invested more in the share market, then that'd be great. So anyway, Costello accepted that recommendation and implemented it. But the trouble is that it didn't result in people buying shares. It resulted in people investing in property. And the thing is that the negative gearing was already in place. That's been always the case, that you could deduct your losses on any investment, not just property, but any investment. You could deduct the losses from other income, not just the income from that investment or investments generally. So negative gearing has been there for a while. But what happened was that the 50% capital gains tax discount in 1999 really supercharged the benefit of negative gearing. So it meant that you could invest in an asset, i.e. a property, that was loss-making while you owned it, reduce the loss by the amount of your tax, whatever your tax rate was, you could reduce it. If you're on the 45% tax rate, you could reduce it by that much. And then at the end, the capital gains tax was reduced by half. So look, it made investing in property really beneficial, the two things together.
So it made investing in property really beneficial. And what happened to house prices because of that? Because more investors are entering the market.
It just increased.
Pushes up?
It just increased demand for property. And it was actually one of 4 things that happened at the same time in the year 2000, or around about the year 2000. So there was that thing in the end of 1999. Also what happened was that the Reserve Bank reduced interest rates in 2000, even though there was no recession, because the US had gone into recession following the internet bubble bursting in March 2000. That was a crash, basically a huge stock market crash in the US, which led to a stock market crash here, but not as great because we don't have many internet companies. The US went into recession as a result, cut interest rates, and the Reserve Bank of Australia followed suit, even though we didn't have a recession. So there was quite a big cut in interest rates. The other thing that happened was that John Howard reintroduced first home buyer grants, which had first come into being in the 1960s, had been dropped by the Hawke and Keating government, and then Howard reintroduced first home buyer grants in around about the year 2000. And that kind of also led to an increase in demand. And the other thing that happened, which I don't think is fully understood, is that in July 2000, the government changed the way foreign students were dealt with. Up until that point, the foreign student intake into Australia was divided into two. There was those from gazetted countries and those from non-gazetted countries. Gazetted countries included New Zealand, UK, US, Canada, and so on. And the non-gazetted countries included China and India. And it was basically, I think, a hangover from the White Australia policy. And in July that year, that ended. The government removed that, which is obviously about time and a good thing to have done. They also made the transition from a student visa to a permanent residency much easier and more transparent. And so following that, there was a massive increase in foreign students from China and India. And they obviously that led to an increase in permanent migration about 3 years later. So from the year 2005, the net overseas migration into Australia effectively doubled and then tripled. The massive increase in migration occurred after that time. And so this kind of succession of things happened. Capital gains tax discount, reintroduction of first home buyer grants, cut in interest rates, and then a big increase in migration in the second half of the 2000s led to a huge increase in demand for housing, but no increase in supply. And basically supply remained pretty much restricted by planning restrictions that had been in place kind of forever, for a long time, for decades, and they were not in any way dealt with.
Before we get into supply, I did just want to go back and ask about the first home buyers grant, because it does seem to be that kind of go-to policy for successive governments, but never really resolves the problem. Why is it their kind of policy of first resort, and particularly why do they keep going back to it when it doesn't seem to resolve anything?
Well, it obviously doesn't resolve anything because it only increases demand and doesn't increase supply at all. It's simply an announcement by a government that wants to be seen to be doing something, and it helps a few people. So, it's a typical political solution that's a Band-Aid rather than a solution.
Look, housing is one of the defining challenges in our economy.
We have a plan to build 1.2 million homes by the end of the decade.
The line about supply is run most by the property industry because it suits them. The question is not property developers building more high-end homes no one can afford. The question is that right now housing is treated more as a financial asset as a result of the billions of dollars.
The key here is to meet the supply need. Now, just 8 years ago, we were building in Australia 220,000 houses. Under this year, we'll only build about 160,000 houses. So construction is going rapidly backwards. We need to build more houses if we are to house our children.
So if we go then to supply, how do the three levels of government work together, or not work together, I guess, to influence housing supply? Who is building housing at the government level, or how do they work together to address the supply end of the equation?
Well, the way Australia's constitution works is that if something is not actually mentioned in the constitution, then it's the state's responsibility. And housing and planning is not mentioned specifically in the constitution. Therefore, it is a state's responsibility. And the state's delegated to local councils for two reasons. One, so that the decisions are closer to the people who are affected by the decisions. And secondly, so the states can wash their hands of it and don't get blamed. So the councils do the planning. I mean, the fact that the decisions are made effectively by people who are elected, by the people who live in those streets of each area, means that, people who live in suburbs, they don't want them to change. They like them. There they are. And we disparagingly refer to NIMBYism, and that's fair enough. But basically, it's a natural human instinct to say, I like where I live and I want it to stay the same.
Yeah. Australian governments also used to build a lot more public housing. Why did that change?
Well, it was simply a yet another consequence of neoliberalism, which came along during the 70s, 80s and 90s. Governments got out of everything, really. And I suppose it's fair to say that probably they got out of housing earlier than everything else. The involvement of the Commonwealth began with the Commonwealth Housing Commission, which was set up in 1944 and had a big report that basically laid the responsibility for housing as a human right at the foot of governments, and saying that the government is responsible. I can't remember the exact wording, but I've got it in the book as to what that report by the Commonwealth Housing Commission at the time began with, which is that words to the effect that provision of housing is a government responsibility and we need to make sure it happens. And that report actually described what the house should look like, what a typical kitchen should be like, and how close the appliances should be together, and how high the ceilings ought to be. And it was very prescriptive. In fact, it was a bit like, I mean, this is a bit of a this excursion, but it was a bit like the Harvester Judgment of 1907, which set up Australia's centralised wage fixing system. And the judge, Justice Higgins, actually went through how much a housewife needs to make in order to feed the family, and that was what they agreed would be the wages. And the same kind of thing happened in 1944 when they came up with the Housing Commission thing, and they said this is the house that Australians require, and it's the government's responsibility to make sure they get it. And so what happened was the Commonwealth government provided the money to the states for them to do to build the Housing Commission. So there's, obviously in most Australian cities, there's tons of, when I grew up, there was tons of Housing Commission places, both houses and apartments, and they were rented out. Now, Bob Menzies came into power with a housing minister named Bill Spooner, and they believed, possibly rightly, that renters vote Labor and owners vote Liberal. So they thought that the way to ensure that the Liberal Party stayed in power was to ensure that the renters became owners. And so they basically forced the states to sell most of their Housing Commission places either to the tenants or somebody else. And so there was basically a move away from, during the Menzies government, there was a big move away from Housing Commission provision provided by state governments towards ownership, and is gradually over the years accelerated by Malcolm Fraser and then by Hawke and Keating, a reduction in the amount of housing that was actually built by governments, and so that it became negligible.
And what has that done to the market, I guess? Did the Australian government having a direct role in building public housing, how did that impact the rest of the market? And is that part of the problem of unaffordability today, that's kind of absent?
Well, it certainly provided affordable housing to the proportion of the population that requires it. And then when they got out, there was nobody doing the same thing. I mean, affordable housing was a thing, and then it's not a thing. It obviously tends to provide increase the supply of housing in general, which tends to hold prices down.
More in check.
Yeah.
Sell up. That's the ominous warning to homeowners by the Reserve Bank governor.
If it turns out, for example, that inflation starts to go up again, or it's much stickier than we think, we're not getting it down, then we won't hesitate to move and raise interest rates again.
In other words, things aren't getting better, they're getting worse.
It comes after Jim Chalmers courted some controversy for suggesting the RBA rate hikes had been smashing the economy.
I think the Australian people, frankly, expect me to tell it like it is. And I've been making that point for some months. What I said overnight wasn't new.
If we want to talk about that idea of owners, irrespective of who they vote for, obviously we've seen this year a huge part of the fall in living standards and the cost of living crisis has been all the successive interest rate rises, in particular hitting mortgage holders really hard. And you argue in the book that using interest rates and housing to regulate the economy is quote, essentially a policy of cruelty. So can you just talk to me a little bit about why you wrote that and what the impact of those successive rate rises has been?
Well, I mean, everything has to be seen against the background of house prices having increased from 3 to 4 times income to around about now 9 times income. So that's changed everything about how the economy works, about how society works. The fundamental essential of life, which is a dwelling, roof over your heads, now costs more than twice what it did before in relation to income. So, a house price on its own is not meaningful until you relate it to incomes. And so the fact that it's gone from 3 to 4 times income to 9 times income is a massive change to everything. And that has led to a huge increase in debt, household debt. Average mortgages have increased. The amount of bank lending has obviously increased. So therefore, that makes any increase in interest rates have much more of an impact, both on the economy generally and perhaps more importantly on individual families. So therefore, the increase in interest rates that has occurred is much more cruel on individual families than previously it was the case. I mean, I was around when interest rates went to 17, 18% in 1989. Now, that was a massive increase, obviously, in interest rates. Before that, the mortgage rate was 13%. So it wasn't, it sounds terrible, like 17 to 18% interest rates, which the cash rate, which is true, it was. But the mortgage rate didn't go up that much. When the cash rate in the past couple of years has gone from 0.1% to 4.35%, mortgage rates as a result have gone from 2% to 6.5% to 7%. So they've more than tripled, whereas in 1989 the mortgage rate didn't even double. It went from 13 to 17% or something. It was bad and it was difficult to live through, but the increase in outgoings that has occurred most recently has been enormous. And it needs to be looked at in the context of mortgage rates, not the cash rate. The cash rate going from 0.1 to 4.35 is an increase of 43-fold, which is not relevant to people's lives. The mortgage rate was 2% roughly, and now it's, as I say, it's more than triple that. So outgoings have tripled, and at the same time, Australian families have got much more debt, both in aggregate and individually, than they had before, simply as a result of the house prices going up so much. You have to borrow much more.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to ask you about that really seems to impact homeowners and part of the cost of living is the cost of insurance. And the Australia Institute here, we've done a little bit of research looking at how the rising cost of insurance is linked to climate change. How do you think really big policy issues that are also unresolved, like climate change, how is it going to impact the housing market going forward?
Oh, well, it's going to have a massive impact on the housing market because large parts of Australia are becoming uninsurable and probably uninhabitable. So, look, obviously you guys have done the work on insurance costs and I haven't, but obviously there have been big increases in insurance so that insurance is becoming unaffordable for a lot of people, particularly those who live in floodplains and who live in or near forests. So, that, it seems to me likely that, in 10, maybe 20 years' time, people won't be able to live in those places. They'll have to come somewhere else. They'll have to go to the cities, which will increase demand even more for housing in those places. And then that's without thinking about the large amount of climate refugees that will likely show up in Australia from Pacific Islands and possibly Bangladesh. I mean, there's a lot of people in the world possibly going to become homeless who are going to have to be accommodated.
Somewhere, yeah. One of the things you argue is that it's going to be almost impossible to return the price of housing to what it was when you and your wife and your parents first bought houses without tackling or getting rid of that idea that housing is a wealth generation thing as opposed to everyone needs a roof over their head. Why is that shift in perspective so important to halting this problem of housing affordability?
Well, because I think that policy-wise, it's going to be very difficult to achieve this. There needs to be a national consensus that it's required. The whole electorate needs to be behind it, it seems to me. However, the whole electorate or most of the electorate own a house, and everyone kind of likes the price of houses going up a lot. In fact, even people who've bought recently who are struggling, they really want and need the price of their house to keep rising and keep rising quite rapidly, so they can build some equity. And even the people who don't own a house, who are renters, think about home ownership as the property ladder. They want to get on the property ladder, and so I think the sort of mindset of Australians in general is that this houses represent a ladder, and you've got to be on it. It's just a mindset that's destructive, it seems to me. I mean, but how do you get out of it? I mean, it'll take more than a few speeches by politicians trying to persuade us out of it. I mean, that's not going to work. The only thing that will work is that it's not a property ladder for a while. That it needs to not house prices need to not increase for a while, both to restore the price to income ratio to something approaching what it was, and secondly, to just change everyone's mind about what housing is about. Housing should be just a place to live rather than something you invest in. I mean, it's an essential. It'll be like saying, well, we're going to have a milk market, and we're all going to invest in milk and make money out of milk, and it's going to keep rising at sort of 6%, 7% a year. Then isn't that great? But it's just actually just an essential of life. I don't know whether milk is the correct analogy, but I'm just talking about, here's an essential of life that's a market, an investment market that people want and in some cases need to keep increasing in price, which is destructive. And the only way we're going to have house prices not rise, this is a big picture statement, the only way that's going to happen is if there's an oversupply of housing for a few years, quite a long time, like 10 years. We need an oversupply of housing for 10 years. And, it's very encouraging that governments, both state and federal, are focused on this now. It has become such a crisis and such a political issue that everybody's talking about it. Everyone understands that this needs to be to be tackled. And although it's true that negative gearing and capital gains tax discount appear to be off the policy table, they are at least working on increasing supply and dealing with focusing to some extent on immigration, although they're not doing that very successfully. But, there is some sort of discussion at least about that and doing something about it. But obviously most of the focus is on increasing supply.
So you're very clear in the book that the housing crisis is the result of deliberate policy choices accumulating over time. And then if we make different choices, things can change, obviously. So you've outlined a whole bunch of different things that we need to tackle. Without it being the silver bullet, what would be your top priority for government in terms of making housing more affordable?
Well, I do think that the negative. I do think the policies that the ALP took to the 2016 and 2019 elections, which is to focus negative gearing on new housing only, and to reduce the capital gains tax discount from 50 to 25%. Those are good policies, and they should happen. And part of the reason they should happen, if not the main one, is because it would help change people's thinking about housing as an investment. Now, I don't think it would take more than that to do that, but still, one of the reasons that people think about housing as an investment is because it gets the investing in housing gets a tax break. So therefore, it's it appears to be encouraged by government. So that needs to be changed. Probably it might be better to just go back to making the capital gains tax CPI adjusted. And the reason that the shift from CPI adjustment or inflation adjustment to 50% discount was so had such an impact back then was because people don't understand the CPI. Most people kind of, they understand inflation is whatever it is, but in terms of trying to figure out in your head what the impact of 5 or 10 years of CPI on your capital gain would be, no one's got any idea.
Yeah.
Whereas a 50% discount is very clear. Everyone gets a discount, and it just made it so much simpler and easier to understand. And it's possible a good idea to go back to that, to the inflation adjustment, so nobody gets it anymore.
Yeah.
So that'd be fine as far as I'm concerned, because accountants can figure that out.
Yeah. And as you said, it really does get to perhaps that shift in mindset that you were talking about that's required.
Yeah. But look, the main thing is that the governments, state, federal and local governments, need to find a way to increase the supply of housing. Now, most of the governments, in particular Victoria and New South Wales, are focused on high-rise apartment building around existing infrastructure such as railway stations, and that's what the focus is on, and I don't think that's going to succeed for two reasons. One is that apartments are not a good business at the moment. You can't make any money from building apartments. They cost too much to build and you can't sell them for enough. The only apartments that are getting built now are luxury apartments for downsizers. So the idea that we're going to solve the housing crisis with, affordable high-rise apartments is, I think, a fantasy. I sort of said in the book that really because of that, probably the best thing is for more greenfields land to be opened up around cities and in regional areas for extra housing with fast train transport, which I really, I think that's also probably a fantasy. It's a nice fantasy, but Australian governments simply can't afford it. The cost of fast trains to, Bathurst and Newcastle and Geelong and Bendigo and Ballarat is just too much. It's not going to happen. So there's just got to find a way. How are we going to do it? And the answer has to be smaller unit type developments, not high rise, smaller unit type developments in infills and suburbs on land that's available. So we have to take up some of the parkland that's around, empty areas within the suburbs where there's existing infrastructure there that doesn't have to be built. And look, is there enough of that? I don't know. Maybe not.
I might humbly suggest we take over or nationalise some golf courses before we get rid of public parks. But
that's right. No, that's fair enough. And look, there are a lot of golf courses, probably arguably more golf courses than we need. So maybe somebody needs to figure out how many golf courses do we actually need.
I might tell our researchers to get onto that one.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on the show today, Alan.
No worries, Ebony. Thanks.
Thank you. You can get your own copy of Alan's book, The Great Divide, Australia's Housing Mess and How to Fix It, in all good bookstores. We would love to hear your thoughts on the show, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. We're now also on Blue Sky as well. And don't forget, you can order your copy of the very first book from Australia Institute Press today. What's the Big Idea? Offers 32 ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Sally McManus, Amy Ramakis, and Professor Peter Doherty. You can order it now via our website at australiainstitute.org.au. And get in quick so you can get that book before Christmas. This is our last regular episode of Follow the Money for 2024. Over the next few weeks, we'll be sharing our Summer Book Club series, featuring some of our favourite editions of Australia's biggest book club and some of our favourite authors from 2024. Thanks for listening.